The world had turned into a white, roaring monster. Just yesterday, Ilara had been cozy in her little trailer, the one she used as her base for studying elk in the Montana wilderness. She had watched the first snowflakes fall with a scientist's curiosity. Now, that curiosity was gone, replaced by a cold, squeezing fear. Her trailer was small, just a metal box on wheels, really, but it had always felt safe. It had a tiny kitchen, a bed under the window, and walls covered in her maps and notes. She knew a big storm was coming. She had prepared. She had food, water, and a radio to check in with the ranger station. But the storm didn't just come. It attacked. The wind didn't whistle. It screamed like it was angry at the mountains themselves. The snow wasn't falling. It was being thrown sideways, smothering everything. For hours, it went on. The trailer shook and groaned. Ilara tried the radio again and again, but all she heard was static. The world outside her window was just a blur of gray and white. She wrapped herself in a blanket and tried to read, but the noise was too loud. It felt like being inside a drum. Then, a new sound cut through the wind. A deep, groaning crack. It wasn't thunder. It was close. It was the sound of something huge breaking. She didn't even have time to stand up. The world exploded in a slam of noise and motion. Something immense hit the roof with the force of a truck. The whole trailer lurched, metal screaming in protest. The ceiling above her bed caved inwards with a sickening crunch. A blast of freezing air and snow poured through the opening. A thick, dark branch, heavy with ice, was now lying across her pillow where her head had been seconds before. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. She scrambled off the bed, slipping on the floor that was already tilting. The main weight of a giant pine tree was on her roof. She could hear the metal supports buckling, a slow, grinding sound that was worse than the wind. The walls on one side were bowing inward. Her home was being crushed, and she was trapped inside. Think. She had to think. The door was on the side where the tree was. It would be jammed shut, blocked by snow and branches. The window. The small window over the tiny kitchen sink. She moved quickly, her breath coming in white puffs. She grabbed her backpack, the one she used for day trips. With shaking hands, she dumped out its contents, notebooks, pencils, binoculars. She shoved in what mattered: a first aid kit, a water bottle, a few protein bars from the counter, her dead radio, and a heavy flashlight. She pulled on her thickest coat, her boots, and her gloves. She wrapped a scarf around her face. The trailer gave another loud moan, tilting more. A cabinet door swung open and plates crashed to the floor. There was no more time. ELA. R.A. climbed onto the counter, her boots slipping on the metal surface. The window was small, and outside it was a wall of swirling white. She pushed at the latch. It was frozen shut. She banged at it with the heel of her hand, the pain sharp and bright. Nothing. She looked around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the heavy flashlight in her bag. She took it out, turned it around, and with a short, hard swing, she smashed the glass. The wind howled through the new hole, sucking the warmth from the trailer in an instant. She used the flashlight to knock away the jagged pieces around the edges. Then, pushing her backpack out first, she began to squeeze through the opening. Her coat caught on a shard of glass. She pulled, and it tore with a ripping sound. Cold, so cold it burned, hit her skin. She wiggled and pushed, and finally tumbled out into the snow. The world was a nightmare of noise and blinding whiteness. The wind stole her breath. She was in a drift that came up to her chest. She looked back at her trailer. It was a sad, broken thing, half buried, with a giant tree lying on top of it like a conqueror. If she had stayed, She would not have gotten out. She had to get away from the tree in case more branches fell. She had to find shelter. But where? The ranger station was miles away, and she couldn't see 10 feet in front of her. The forest was a ghostly, shifting maze. Ilara started walking. She didn't know if she was going the right way. She just knew she couldn't stop. The snow was so deep. Every step was a fight. She would lift her leg high, push it forward, and sink down again. It was like walking through frozen, white concrete. Her legs began to ache, then burn. The cold seeped through her clothes. It crept into her gloves and up her sleeves. Her face, even covered by the scarf, went numb. The world started to shrink down to the next step, and the next. Don't stop. Keep moving. That was the only thought in her head. Hours blurred together. The light began to fade, turning the white world a gloomy, terrifying blue. Her body was screaming at her to rest. Just for a minute. Just to sit down. She knew that was a lie. Sitting down in this was giving up. But the tiredness was so heavy her foot caught on something hidden under the snow, a root or a rock. She fell forward, plunging face first into the soft, cold powder. For a moment, she just lay there. It was so quiet underneath, the wind muffled. It would be easy to close her eyes. So easy. Then a picture flashed in her mind, her crumpled trailer. The tree that had tried to crush her. A spark of anger flared inside her. No, not like this. She pushed herself up, gasping. She wiped the snow from her eyes. And that's when she saw it. Not a natural path. The trees on either side were too even. The snow between them was lower, flatter. Someone had shoveled here. Recently, it was the first sign of another human being she had seen in days. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered inside her chest. She used the last of her strength to follow the path. It wound through the pines, a promise in the growing dark. And then the trees opened up. There was a cabin. It was not large or fancy, but it was solid, made of thick, dark logs. And from its stone chimney, a thin, beautiful line of gray smoke rose into the stormy sky. Light glowed in one of the windows. Ilara stumbled the last few feet. She fell against the heavy wooden door. She didn't have the strength to knock. She just leaned there, her forehead against the cold wood. From inside, she heard the sound of a chair scraping on a floor. Then, the soft thud of footsteps. A latch clicked. The door opened inward, and she almost fell into the warmth. A man stood there, backlit by the firelight from inside. He was tall, with a quiet stillness about him. He wore simple, warm clothes, and on his hip, in an old leather holster, was a long-barreled revolver. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his eyes taking in her torn coat, her snow-crusted face, the sheer exhaustion in her stance. His face showed no smile, no shock. Just a calm, deep assessment. After a long moment, he stepped back silently, making space in the doorway. It was all the invitation she needed. Ilara Vance, the scientist who studied life, stumbled over the threshold into the silent gunslinger's cabin, leaving the collapsing white world behind. The warmth hit her first. It was a solid, physical thing, wrapping around her frozen body like a blanket. It carried the smell of pine logs burning, of old wood, and underneath it all, the simple, good smell of simmering soup. After the howling, scentless void of the storm, it was almost overwhelming. She stood just inside the door, dripping snowmelt onto a rough woven rug, her legs trembling. The man closed the heavy door behind her, and the world went quiet. The scream of the wind became a low, distant moan. The sudden silence felt louder than the storm had been. He still hadn't spoken. He moved past her, his boots making soft sounds on the plank floor. He went to the stone fireplace, where a large pot hung from an iron hook. He picked up a folded blanket from a nearby chair, a thick, gray wool thing, and held it out to her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," Elara croaked, her voice rough from cold and disuse. Her fingers, stiff and clumsy, fumbled with the buttons of her ruined coat. He watched for a second, then simply reached over. With a few efficient motions, he helped her get the wet coat off, then draped the blanket around her shoulders. The wool was scratchy, but wonderfully warm. He took her soaked coat and hung it on a peg near the fire where it began to steam. He pointed to a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth. Then he turned back to the fire, picked up a ladle, and filled a tin mug from the pot. He handed it to her. The mug was almost too hot to hold, but she clutched it greedily, letting the heat seep into her bones. She took a small sip. It was a strong, salty broth, with bits of meat and wild onion. It tasted like life itself. Only then, as the sharp edge of her panic began to soften, did she look around. The cabin was one room, but it was spacious. It was neat to the point of being bare. There was the fireplace, the small cooking area, a table with one chair, and a bed tucked under a window, shuttered tight against the storm. Everything was made of wood, sanded smooth by time and use. There were no pictures on the walls, no colorful blankets, no little trinkets. It was the home of someone who owned only what they absolutely needed. Her eyes landed on the only thing that looked personal. Hanging from a hook by the door, on a well-worn belt of brown leather, was an empty holster. The gun itself was on the high mantel of the fireplace, out of easy reach. It was an old, long-barreled revolver, its metal dark and carefully oiled. It looked like something from another century. The man had pulled the room's other chair to the opposite side of the fireplace and sat down. He picked up a piece of wood and a small knife from a basket. He didn't look at her, just began to slowly, carefully, shave a long curl of wood from the block. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of his knife, and the wind outside. It was the quiet that unnerved her most. She was used to the constant hum of her own thoughts, to the chatter of the radio, to the sounds of her work. This silence felt deep and deliberate. She felt a need to fill it. "My trailer," she said, her voice still not quite her own. "A tree fell on it, crushed it completely. I got out the window." The man glanced up from his whittling, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. He gave a single slow nod. He understood. He went back to his work. "I'm a biologist," she continued, feeling a strange urge to explain herself, to prove she wasn't just some lost fool. "I study the elk herds up in the high meadows. I was supposed to radio in 2 days ago." She paused, waiting for a question that didn't come. "My name is Elara." He paused his whittling. He looked into the fire, thinking. Then he set the wood and knife down on the floor beside his chair. He leaned forward slightly, and with his finger, traced 2 letters in the fine layer of ash on the stone hearth. C-A-I-N-H. Looked at her to see if she understood. Then sat back and picked up his whittling again. Kane. Not a name he offered freely. It seemed, but one he gave because she had asked. A name from the ashes. "Thank you, Kane," she said softly. For this." Another small nod. That was all. The broth and the heat were working on her. A deep, heavy exhaustion began to pull at her, the kind that comes after terror lets go. Her eyelids grew heavy. She watched the firelight dance on the logs of the wall opposite her. Kane noticed. Without a word, he stood up. He went to a low cupboard and pulled out a folded hide. It looked like deer or elk, and laid it on the floor near the fire, on the warm stones. Over that, he spread a thick, felted pad in a single wool blanket. He gestured to it. It was a bed. A simple, humble bed on the floor, but it was the most welcoming thing she had ever seen. She stood, her body aching. She placed the empty tin mug on the hearth. I don't want to take your bed," she said, glancing at the proper bed under the window. He shook his head once, firmly. He pointed again to the floor by the fire. This was not up for discussion. He would take the chair. There was no point arguing. Her body was making the decision for her. She lay down on the makeshift bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The heat from the stones radiated through the pad, easing the chill that had settled deep in her muscles. She watched Kane's shadow, huge and flickering on the wall, as he banked the fire for the night. He sat back in his chair, the piece of wood in his hands again. He didn't look at her. He just stared into the flames, his face calm and still, his hands moving with that slow, steady rhythm dot in the quiet dark. With the storm shut out and a silent guardian by the fire, Elara felt the last of her fear melt away. The questions about the gun, about the silence, about who this man was, they were still there, buzzing softly in the back of her mind. But they were no longer urgent. For the first time since that terrible crack had split her world, she felt safe. Her eyes closed, and the sound of the wind faded away, replaced by the gentle, living sound of a knife scraping wood and the deep, steady breath of the man keeping watch. Elara woke up to the soft, gray light of a snow-blanketed morning and the smell of coffee. For a moment, curled in the warmth of her blanket by the fire, she was confused. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn logs, not the white plastic of her trailer. Then memory came flooding back, the crushing pine, the blinding walk, the silent man. She sat up slowly. The fire was still going, freshly stoked. Kane was at the small table by the window, which now let in the muted daylight. He was reading a book with a worn, dark cover. A simple metal coffee pot sat on the stove top near the fire. He heard her stir, looked over, and gave a short nod. He got up, poured a cup of the steaming coffee into another tin mug, and brought it to her. He set it on the hearthstone beside her without a word, then returned to his chair and his book. "Thank you," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. The coffee was bitter and strong, and it cleared the last fog from her mind. The storm, she realized, was still raging outside. The wind still howled against the shutters, a constant reminder that the world out there was not yet ready for her. She was a guest, trapped by the weather, in the home of a man who spoke in gestures and ash-written names. The silence, which had felt safe last night, now began to feel heavy. She was a person who lived in words her research notes, her conversations with fellow biologists, the constant internal narration of her observations. Kane's quiet was a wall. She felt a strange need to talk, to fill the space, to explain herself. "I usually track the herd's movement from the ridge west of here," she began, holding the warm mug in both hands. "This time of year, they're moving down to the lower valleys. Or they should be. This storm will have them all sheltering in the pine groves, just like us." She took a sip, watching him. Kane didn't look up from his book, but she saw his head tilt slightly. He was listening. Encouraged, she kept going. She told him about the two dominant bulls she'd been following, one with a broken tine on his left antler. She described the strange behavior of a young cow earlier in the season, who seemed to lead the herd away from a dried-up creek bed. She talked about the lichen patterns on the north side of the rocks, and how the snowpack was thinner this year. She filled the cabin with her voice, with stories of life and movement. Kane listened. He would occasionally glance at her, his eyes a calm, deep blue in the firelight. Sometimes he would give one of his slow, single nods. But he never spoke. When she paused, the silence rushed back in. It felt different now, though. Less like a wall and more like a pool she had been throwing stones into. He wasn't ignoring her. He was absorbing what she said, Her eyes drifted around the cabin again, landing on the few books on a small shelf. They were not what she expected. There were no survival manuals or pulp novels. She saw a thick history of the American West, a book of philosophy by someone with a long name, a field guide to regional geology. This was not the library of a simple hermit. Her gaze finally settled on the gun belt by the door. The revolver was back in its holster now. It looked less like a tool and more like a part of him, like his boots or his coat. A question itched at her, but she felt asking about the gun directly would be like touching a hot stove. It was too personal, too sharp. Instead, she asked about the cabin. "How long have you lived out here?" Kane closed his book, marking his place with a thin strip of leather. He looked into the fire, thinking. He held up one hand, all 5 fingers spread. Then he closed it and opened it again, twice, 10. Then he added 3 more fingers. 13 years. 13 winters in this quiet, solitary space. The thought was staggering to her. "You must know every tree, every animal trail for miles," she said. This time, he offered the smallest hint of a change in his expression. Not a smile, but a slight easing of the lines around his eyes. He nodded again. He did know the day passed in this strange, quiet rhythm. He prepared a simple lunch of pan-fried trout from a frozen creek and flatbread he cooked on the stovetop. She offered to help, but he simply shook his head and pointed back to her chair by the fire. He was a man used to doing things alone, in his own way, in the afternoon. While he was outside briefly chopping more wood from a sheltered pile, she allowed her curiosity to get the better of her. She walked quietly to the bookshelf. She didn't touch anything, just looked. Next to the geology book was a small framed thing she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a photo. It was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the mountains, with tiny, precise notations in a neat script. One notation, near a drawn creek, simply said, "Home." This was clearly his work. The care in the lines spoke of long, patient hours. She heard the scrape of the door and quickly stepped back, feeling a flush of guilt. He came in, his arms full of split logs, his shoulders dusted with snow. He looked at her, then at the bookshelf, then back at her. His face didn't show anger, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement. He knew she had been looking. He set the wood by the fire, brushed the snow from his coat, and went to pour himself more coffee. He had drawn a line with his silence, and she had just peered over it. That evening, as the early winter dark fell, she found her voice again. The need to connect, to bridge the gap with this man who had saved her life, was strong. "You've been very kind," she said. "Most people would. Talk more." Kane, who was stirring the stew pot, paused. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised her. He pointed to his own ear, then gestured vaguely to the walls, to the world outside. Then he pointed to his mouth and gently shook his head. She understood. Out here, listening was how you lived. Listening to the wind, to the animals, to the creak of the trees. Talking was what you did in towns, with people who didn't know how to listen. For him, talking was the less important skill, it was the most he had said all day. It was an explanation, and in its own way, a gift. Alara felt her earlier unease settle. She didn't need to fill his silence with her noise. She just needed to be still in it, to listen as he did. She nodded to show she understood. He gave one of his brief nods back. Later, as they ate the stew in the comfortable quiet, a new sound cut through the wind. It was a long, lonely howl, not far from the cabin. Then another joined it, and another. A wolf pack, close by and on the hunt in the difficult snow. Alara froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She knew wolves were rarely a threat to people, but a large pack, hungry in a deep winter, was unpredictable. It was a wild, primal sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. Kane set his bowl down calmly. He walked to the window and peered out through a narrow gap in the shutters. The howls came again, closer now, a chorus of hunger. They were circling Dot without looking at her. Kane reached for his coat. He didn't go for the gun on its hook. Instead, he pulled on his gloves. "What are you doing?" Elara asked, her voice tight. He held up a hand, a signal to wait, to be still. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the freezing, wolf-filled dark, closing it softly behind him. The moment the door closed, Alara's heart seemed to stop. The cozy cabin suddenly felt like a trap. She rushed to the window, pressing her face to the cold crack in the shutters. She could see almost nothing, just the blur of falling snow in the dark, and the faint orange glow from the cabin window painting the ground. The howls came again, so close they raised goosebumps on her skin. They weren't the distant, romantic calls of storybooks. They were sharp, hungry, and full of intent. She could hear the soft crunch of paws in the snow, moving around the clearing. Then she saw Kane. He was a tall, dark shape standing just beyond the porch, his back straight, facing the trees. He wasn't holding a weapon. His empty hands were held slightly away from his body. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. Instead, he took a deep breath, and from his chest came a sound that made Alara's blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, but it was shaped by a human voice. It was a sound of pure warning, of dominance. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a language. He made the sound again, deeper, longer. It rolled through the clearing and into the trees, cutting through the wind. For a terrible second, there was only silence. Elara held her breath. She imagined glowing eyes in the dark, muscles coiling to spring. Then, a single answering whine came from the pines. It was a submissive sound. It was followed by a soft yip, and then the rustling of bodies moving away. The tense, hunting energy that had pressed against the cabin simply dissolved. The pack was leaving. Kane stood perfectly still for another full minute, listening. Finally, he turned and walked back to the cabin. He opened the door, stepped inside, and brushed the snow from his shoulders. His face was calm, as if he'd just gone out to check the weather. Elara was staring at him, her mouth slightly open. The fear in her chest was now mixed with a shock, so deep she couldn't find words. The quiet man who made coffee and whittled wood had just talked to a wolf pack. And they had listened. He saw her expression. He hung up his coat and went to the fire, holding his palms out to the warmth. He seemed to be deciding something. "How—" Elara finally managed to whisper. "How did you do that?" Kane looked into the flames. He pointed to his eyes, then to his ears, then out towards the forest. "I watch, I listen." Then he pointed to his chest, where his heart was, and made a slow, sweeping gesture that took in the walls, the land, everything. "I belong." He wasn't just living in the wilderness. He was a part of it. The wolves weren't monsters to him. They were neighbors. And he had just reminded them of the boundary of his home. Everything clicked into place for Elara then. The gun, it wasn't for animals. He clearly had no fear of animals, and they seemed to show a strange respect for him. The gun was for something else. It was for the two-legged kind of danger. It was a relic from a past he never spoke of, kept clean and ready, hanging by the door like a forgotten umbrella, just in case the old weather ever returned. He was hiding, but not from the woods. He was hiding in them. The rest of the evening passed in a new kind of quiet. The awe Elara felt was too big for her usual chatter. She watched him move around the cabin, this man who was more a force of nature than a person. He wasn't just a hermit. He was a keeper of an old, vanishing way. He understood the land in his bones, in a way her biology books and careful notes could never capture. Later, as she lay on her bed by the fire, sleep wouldn't come. The wind had finally died down. The storm was blowing itself out. In the new quiet, she heard a different sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping. She turned her head. Cain was back in his chair, the firelight dancing on his face. He had his piece of wood and his knife again, but now she could see what he was making. It wasn't just a shape. He was carving the head of a wolf, its lines simple but powerful, its mouth open in a silent howl. He was carving the memory of what had just happened. He felt her watching. He didn't stop his work, but he held the half-formed carving up for her to see. Then he pointed to her and to the door. For your journey, tears, sudden and hot, stung her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. This rough piece of wood, transformed by his patient hands, was the first true gift she had received from him. It was an acknowledgment. It was a farewell that was coming soon. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. It's perfect." He gave a final nod and went back to his carving, the knife moving with sure, loving strokes. Halara lay back down, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her crumpled trailer, her lost data, the frantic report she would have to make. But those thoughts felt small and far away. They belonged to her old world, the world of noise and schedules. Here, in this quiet cabin, she had learned something. She had learned that listening was more important than speaking. That stillness could be stronger than action. That a man could carry a gun for a forgotten reason, yet find his true power in a low, understanding growl spoken into the dark. The storm outside was over. Her storm inside, the fear, the desperation, was over too. It had been replaced by a deep, calm respect. When she closed her eyes this time, the image in her mind was not of the crushing tree, but of a tall, silent man standing alone in the snow, speaking a language older than words, and being understood. The morning dawned clear and shockingly bright. Sunlight streamed through the cabin window, landing in dazzling squares on the plank floor, filled with dancing motes of dust. The world outside was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow that sparkled like a million tiny diamonds. The silence was no longer the howling kind, but a deep, peaceful hush. Halara woke to find Cain already moving. The fire was high, and the smell of coffee and something baking simple flatbread filled the room. He saw she was awake and gave his usual short nod, but there was a different feeling in the air. A purpose. Today was a day for leaving. She packed her few things back into her battered backpack. Cain, meanwhile, was assembling a kit for her. He worked with quiet efficiency. He took a worn canvas satchel and put in a water skin, strips of dried meat wrapped in cloth, a handful of hard biscuits, and a small pouch of nuts and berries. He added a box of matches, sealed in a tin to keep them dry. It was more food than she could eat in a day, prepared for the possibility that her journey might take longer than expected. Finally, he walked to the corner where he kept his wood and tools. He came back holding the finished carving. The wolf's head was smooth in her hand, the details of the snout and ears sharp and clear. It was a beautiful, powerful little thing. She ran her thumb over it and looked up at him. "I'll keep this always," she said, and she meant it. He accepted this with a nod. Then he went to the wall and took down a walking stick she hadn't noticed before. It was made of a dark, polished wood with a natural curve for a handle. It was clearly something he had made and used himself. He held it out to her. She took it. It was the perfect height and felt solid and sure in her grip. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling inadequate for the second time that morning. They ate a quick breakfast together in the sunlight. The usual quiet was there, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was the quiet of a task that needed doing. When the last bite was finished, Cain stood up. He pulled on his coat and gestured for her to do the same. It was time. Outside, the air was so cold it was sharp in her lungs, but the sun held a whisper of warmth. The world was impossibly white and clean. Cain led the way, breaking a fresh path through the deep snow around the side of the cabin. Her boots crunched loudly in the stillness, while his made almost no sound at all. He led her not back the way she had come, but along another of his hidden, shoveled paths behind the cabin. It wound through a grove of tall pines, their branches bowed with snow. After about 10 minutes of walking, they emerged onto the edge of an old, overgrown road. The snow here was smooth and unbroken, but the wide cut through the forest was unmistakable. An old logging track. Cain stopped at the edge of the trees, where his private path met the public road. He pointed east, down the gentle slope of the road. Then he did something he hadn't done since the first night. He spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together from lack of use. 2 miles, he said, the words clear in the frozen air. It's been plowed. Elara stared at him. Those 3 words meant more than all her chatter from the past days. They were a gift of direction, of certainty. They were a farewell. She adjusted the straps of her pack and gripped the walking stick. She looked back at the path that led to his hidden cabin, then at the man standing beside her. He looked more solid, more real here in the daylight, his breath making little clouds in the air. The quiet guardian of the woods. I won't tell anyone, she said suddenly.